So today I'd like to talk to you about the energy gap and bioenergy, and how bioenergy might have a role in filling that energy gap. So a little bit of background: energy demand out to 2030. We know that there's an energy crisis, but there's also a food crisis and possibly a climate change crisis. Intergovernmental bodies tell us that demand for energy is rising, and it's likely to rise by 50% up to 2030. And those are data from the International Energy Agency. Food demand is also rising between 50 and 70% according to the FAO. Water demand at the same time is increasing. We imagine that there'll be a 30% rise in demand out to 2030. And about 70% of water is currently used in agriculture in one form or another. So this is what we call the food, energy, water nexus. It places the planet in a precarious position, and we need to consider how we might address some of these problems. So if we look a little bit more at energy demand out to 2030, we can see that largely energy demand in the OECD countries from 1980 to 2030, as you can see in this graph on the blue line, has changed rather little over those last 20 or 30 years, and is likely to change. The demand isn't going to increase greatly in those countries. The rest of the non-OECD countries, and China and India in particular, will make a big part of this increasing energy demand as their societies become more sophisticated and take on some of the technologies which we've had access to in the OECD countries in the last 100 years or so. And so not only is energy demand increasing in the planet, but also we can say that energy demand is changing where the demand is coming from. And so largely China and India, but some of those other countries will all be contributing to this change. And I guess we could say that the paradigm of development over the last 30, 50 or 100 years has been very, very tightly linked to fossil fuel consumption. So we can see here that GDP per capita in relation to primary energy consumption per capita is very tightly linked. So we can see that a nation such as the USA has a very high GDP and a very high primary energy consumption. So this link between what we might call wealth or wealth-creating activities and energy consumption is very, very tight. And you can look down and see Australia and the UK and some of the rest of Europe. And right down the bottom of this figure, we look at China and India, and we can imagine that their aspirations are to move up this curve, that as they generate more wealth, they will utilise more energy. And we know that the consequences of burning fossil fuels are extreme. The consensus of scientific evidence from bodies such as the IPCC tells us that if we put radiatively active gases into the atmosphere, they're very highly likely to lead to the changes in climate which we're observing at the moment. So the question is whether we can halt this change at a 2-degree sea rise or whether it will go beyond that. But just to remind you that those greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, that's the major greenhouse gas, and other gases such as N2O, methane, and of course water vapour, which is a naturally occurring radiatively active gas, which bathes planet Earth in a rather pleasant environment which biological systems, animals, plants, microbes have evolved to tolerate. And so if we change the balance of these gases, we know that climate change is occurring and it's likely to have devastating impacts on us. So what's the evidence for this climate change occurring? Well, I'm not going to go over this in any detail, but if we look back in history, even as far back as 1856, we can see that Tyndall in the Royal Society first demonstrated that gases can absorb radiant heat. And that was the very, very beginnings of our understanding of the science of climate change. And we can move through all of these scientists. In the 1950s, Charles Keeling began measuring atmospheric carbon dioxide at a pristine site in Hawaii, and that's become now known as the Keeling curve, and it's some of the best data which has been monitoring carbon dioxide since the 1950s. So a whole series of events have occurred that provide this evidence that climate change is occurring. And in 1988, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was formed as an illustrious body to gather the evidence and provide governments with some resolution onto how we might tackle these increases in greenhouse gases. So climate change is occurring, the evidence is pretty strong, and at the same time energy demand is increasing. And so what can we do to address that? Well, the International Energy Agency, and this is one of their figures I'm showing here, has developed a number of scenarios to address this question, which predict out to 2030 and imagine a world which is sustainable, where we can survive out to 2030 in a reasonable way. And their 450 scenario is a scenario where we try to maintain the concentration of carbon dioxide at 450 parts per million, moving out to 2030. And what this suggests is that there will be a large increase in zero carbon fuels of some type. And you can see that on the green line in this figure. So these zero carbon fuels will be increasing, and fossil fuels will plateau. And by changing our energy mix in this way towards renewables, there's some hope that we could commit to this 450 scenario. And if we look at that in a little bit more detail, we can see that we have to increase our renewables in this mix, this 450 scenario. So we look at the bars there, the bars on the right, we can see out to 2020 and 2030 that to save the gigatons of carbon that we need to save, we need a portfolio of measures. Now, about half, or a little bit more, over half of those measures are to do with energy efficiency. So the way we use energy, the way industry uses energy, the way homes use energy. We need to improve the energy efficiency of a whole range of technologies. That's important, and it's said, and we need to do that. But then going on from that, the renewables is also an important part of meeting that 450 parts per million. To 2020, we need about 19% of the carbon reduction met by renewables, and out to 2030, that's increasing to around 23%. So a whole basket of renewables will be required if we're going to get to that 450 scenario. And how might they be met? Well, you can look here at the red bars, which are the reference scenario. So we can think of that as a sort of business as usual scenario, if we carry on more or less in the way we are with our current energy portfolio. And then if we try to move to this 450 scenario, those are the green bars, you can see that certain technologies have to increase in importance. Coal, of course, declines in its contribution in terawatt hours to energy, and nuclear, hydro, wind and biomass, which is the subject I'm particularly interested in, increase in their importance alongside solar and a few other things. So bioenergy, biomass, has a role in contributing to future scenarios. So what's the story so far? We know that energy demand will increase. All of the predictions tell us that. We know that in order to limit the increase in greenhouse gases, largely carbon dioxide, which are damaging the environment, we need a mixed portfolio of renewables. And indeed, in the OECD countries, it's suggested that 60% of energy could come from renewables by 2030 in this scenario. And so they have an important role to play. But further than that, what about biological resources for energy? How can we grapple with some of the natural cycles that are occurring on the planet for things like carbon, water and nitrogen, and harness them for our benefit so that we can utilise them more effectively as an energy resource. And just an aside, if you did a search in Web of Science on bioenergy, as I did recently, now I'm one of the geeky people who's been working on bioenergy since the early 1990s, but if you just look at the numbers of papers, scientific papers published in this area, there are lots. It's increasing dramatically, it's a big area of interest, and so for you guys that might mean that it's a good area where you might wish to invest in your future and see it that sustainability will be providing a number of jobs in the future. So what's the ultimate source of renewables? Well, it's the energy of the sun, providing a huge, vast 3 million exajoules. And we can do various calculations, but if we can just harness a fraction of that energy, we could supply our requirements on planet Earth. And so how can we harness that energy? Well, one thing we can do is use green plants in the process of photosynthesis, which convert energy from the sun into simple sugars and complex carbohydrates. It's not a particularly efficient process, often less than 1% efficient, but it offers us the potential to tackle this problem. And in a scoping study which was done by BP, Beyond Petroleum, a few years ago now, they came to a rather similar conclusion. So they considered technology options, and this particular figure is just considering transportation energy, so liquid fuels largely. How can we, what are the liquid fuels of the future? Where do they come from? And when BP did this analysis, you can see here that they were concerned on the bottom axis about threat from climate change, whether it was low or whether it was whether the concern related to climate change was low or high, and also whether availability of oil and gas or the availability of future oil and gas was low or high. And if you look at the top right quadrant of this figure, you can see that these things called advanced biofuels were always coming out as being a good option for fuel in the future. So what do we mean by advanced biofuels? Well, we mean taking biomass from lignocellulosic crops, so non-food crops, and converting that to a liquid fuel. And currently it may be bioethanol, or it could be biodiesel, or it could be some other advanced fuels which are at the research stage. So there's some preliminary indication that liquid biofuels could be a good option. The question's always asked, do we have enough biomass? Well, again, many studies in the last couple of years, but essentially what the literature is telling us is that we use less than 1% of the land on planet Earth for active cultivation of crops for our own purposes, and that there's considerable potential biomass in other biomes of the world, some of which could be available as an energy resource. So there's a huge potential resource, and we're utilising rather little of it, even for our current food, feed and fuel requirements. And let's not forget that some of the largest organisms on planet Earth are in fact plants. Here's a specimen tree from the western coast of the USA. It's one of the giant trees out there. It's a western red hemlock. It's the largest specimen in the world. So forests have most of the carbon locked up from the planet, forest ecosystems, largely tropical ecosystems, and much of this carbon, of course, is underground. But nevertheless, this use of plants, this ability to lock up carbon, is of potential interest to us if we can only harness it for energy. What about biomass resource closer to home in the UK? What does our biomass resource look like? Well, this was taken from the 2006 biomass strategy for the UK. It was a document published by DEFRA, and we're producing about 30 million tonnes of biomass annually, and we recover very, very little of that for energy, but we do waste a huge amount of it. I won't go through it in detail, but up to 10 million tonnes of food waste. for example, and 3 million tonnes of straw that we don't make best use of. And so if we could only capture some of these waste streams and turn them into energy from biomass, that would also be of value. So the potential may be there. Green plants may be able to supply some of the answer to this problem. And so in more detail, how might we go about doing that out to 2030? So if we think about green plants for transport, heat and power, and the good thing about green plants is that, yes, we can break the resource down, we can release sugars, we can ferment the sugars and make things like bioethanol, but they can also be used for heat and power. They can also be combusted, they can be co-combusted with coal, and so there are various ways that these feedstocks might be used. So an overview then, what does it mean? What do we do? In the very simplest terms, we know that on the right here, if we burn fossil fuels, we extract carbon-rich resources from the earth, and that when those fossil fuels are burnt or combusted, we have atmospheric carbon dioxide release. So we can see here on the right for the biofuel chain that if we grow a green plant, the plant grows, it captures carbon, and that biofuel is then either combusted or hydrolyzed, and CO2 may be released, we gain fuel, but then that CO2 is then fixed back into a plant which is newly grown. Now it's a very simplistic view. If you look in that simple way at what the carbon cost, the net life cycle emissions might be, you can see that a ballpark of 65 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour is a bioenergy crop, whereas for a fossil fuel chain, we know that's likely to be over 1,000 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. Now, that's our simplistic view that in general, green plants are good things because they gain carbon and release carbon, so we can make them somewhere close to carbon neutral. Of course, as we've gone through the process of trying to utilise these fuels, it's become a much more complex issue. And we now know that to get those carbon savings, we have to work very hard at making a sustainable bioenergy crop. And we'll go into a little bit of detail about that later. So how does it work? Basically, we have the basic reactions of photosynthesis that you're all familiar with. This produces some carbohydrates, which we can then combust to release energy and a byproduct, ash or char of some type, depending on the process. Plants are the ultimate source of renewable energy because they convert the energy of the sun into these simple carbohydrates, so sugars and starches, so things that you're familiar with in a cob of sweet corn or another herbaceous crop. And then there are these complex carbohydrates, which you may be less familiar with, which have the generic term of lignocellulosics, woody or fibrous parts of the plant, which are in general about 50% cellulose, which is mostly carbon. So this is what we might call wood, or wood with a lot of lignin, lignocellulosics. And these are in forests. They're the fibrous parts of plants. We talked about wheat straw. Wheat straw is basically lignocellulosics. So these have often been seen as waste products when in Brazil they harvest sugarcane. There's a huge amount of biomass, the lignocellulosic resource, which currently isn't utilised. And so the lignocellulosic resource is one where we might look to the future. So we can use plants. We can use a variety of plants, and they might become carbon neutral sources of renewable energy, depending largely on this thing called the system boundary, where we draw the system boundary for our energy system. Which plants for bioenergy? Well, we can start to think about different types of bioenergy plants. They might be good or they might be bad. We have these things highlighted in red here, which we call the first generation crops, and they're largely food crops. So they're the crops which we've been cultivating for several thousand years, and we know a lot about them. They've been bred and selected, and they provide a very valuable resource. And they've had a fuel role, things like maize, oilseed rape, the grain of wheat, sugar beet, other crops from the tropics, and of course sugarcane, which we may all be familiar with. Second generation crops are these dedicated lignocellulosics, trees, fast growing trees like willow, poplar, eucalyptus and others, we're always looking for others, and grasses, giant grasses. There's one in particular called giant elephant grass, which is a C4 grass. That's a type of biochemistry and photosynthesis. So it's essentially a tropical grass which grows very fast, and we might be able to harness that for bioenergy, and that's called miscanthus. And then in blue here there are the third generation algal crops and artificial photosynthesis systems. So algae provide potentially an important resource, and it's also possible now using synthetic biology that we can actually manufacture a photosynthesizing cell, and there's quite a lot of work going into this, to produce a system which is much more efficient and effective at harnessing light energy and turning it into biomass or chemicals which we can use for energy. And so these crops are all in the mix. Why are we still interested in these crops? Well, the algal story is an interesting story, in that algal bioenergy, liquid biofuel, is currently being researched very hard as a jet fuel, a potential jet fuel for the aviation industry, because that's one of the most difficult industries to decarbonise. It requires a very high specification liquid fuel. We can't run an electric plane, and so it's where some of the algal research is in particular being targeted. So perhaps you're not aware, but bioenergy already contributes to the global energy mix. So of the renewables, we can see here the green slice of the pie is global renewables. Of those renewables, most of them are bioenergy, actually, not wind or not solar, not hydro, but bio. But they are the more traditional use of wood biomass, because a huge number of people on the planet still use wood as a primary means for cooking fuel. And so biomass has been used, but it hasn't been utilised as effectively as it could be. Bioenergy chains are complex, they're complicated, and we can see here some of the chains for combustion, gasification and anaerobic digestion. And this is what makes bioenergy such a powerful feedstock, because you can combust, gasify and digest it. So we can take a whole range of crops, put them through a whole range of technologies and produce electricity, heat, or combined electricity and heat. And as I say, very, very other few energy options are so flexible, but at the same time pretty complicated too. If we look at liquid fuel chains, these are even more complex. A whole raft of feedstocks there in blue on the left, and a whole raft of processes can lead to, in red, can lead to several different fuel types as outputs. So biodiesel, ethanol, bio-oil, pyrolysis oil and biomethane. And these are at various stages of technology development and deployment. Now, in the most recent energy crisis, which we saw over the last decade, the USA decided to focus on using maize, which they grow extensively, in this process of hydrolysis and fermentation. So they take the maize crop, the corn, they break it up, they release the sugar from the maize crop through hydrolysis, through attack by enzymes and other mechanisms. They then ferment the released sugar and they produce bioethanol. So that was the chain that they happened to focus on. It was what we might see as a quick win. It enabled bioethanol to be produced rather easily with the current infrastructure that they had. Unfortunately, we now know that that was a particularly poor bioenergy chain for moving towards this carbon neutrality. So the carbon footprint, or the greenhouse gas emissions created from that chain were not particularly good. And indeed, some reports suggest that the energy use in this chain could be as poor as that of a fossil fuel chain. In certain circumstances, it could be even worse. So that's perhaps an example of a chain which we might wish to avoid. We take a food crop, we use a lot of expensive chemicals to grow it, nitrogen, pesticides, etc., which contribute to the carbon balance. We then use a lot of enzymes to break the grains and to produce another lot of microorganisms to produce the bioethanol. So that's some of the downside of using bioenergy. What about in the UK? What's going on in, a little bit closer to home? Are we investing in bioenergy at any scale? Well, the UK, rather with our climate change negotiations, we have been at the forefront in developing policy to utilise bioenergy. And even in the 80s, we were working on the most efficient bioenergy chains, which are those which take biomass and use it for heat and power. But current drivers to use more bioenergy are here. So we have something called an energy white paper, which is the policy document which is informing how we move towards a low carbon economy out to the future. And it tells us that we wish to generate about 30% of our electricity supply from renewables by 2020. And a large part of that will be fulfilled by using bioenergy. It's been estimated that bioenergy provides one of the best environmentally efficient and cost-effective mechanisms to decarbonise electricity supply in the UK. And so that there is a big drive to utilise these resources. In the EU, we have an even more ambitious target in something called the Renewable Energy Directive. A few years ago, we had something called the Stern Review, and Stern put a price on the cost of reducing carbon emissions. And it was again focused on maintaining the rise in carbon dioxide to 450 by 2050 is what he identified in his report as a tipping point. And the conclusion of that report very much was that we can't afford not to act. So to do nothing would be to our detriment, because the cost of doing some of these things later on, as the climate worsens, will become greater. And so that's one of the reasons why we currently have tax incentives on energy companies to invest in renewables, and it's related to some of the controversy that's ongoing about these green taxes on our energy bills. So we also have in Europe something called the Biofuels Directive, the RTFO, and this initially stated that we would replace liquid transport fuels by 2010. About 5% of them would be as renewables. And some of that has been ongoing, but that's stalled, and I'll explain why in a moment. But at the moment, so we have aspirations to become more renewable in our energy supply. It's only a few percent that's contributing to our current energy commitment from bio in the UK. So that's a rather rosy, positive picture of what bioenergy might be able to provide, but we know that it hasn't been such a simple path, and that there are major concerns now about, for example, the greenhouse gas balance of these crops. So I've alluded to some of the work on carbon footprinting of these crops. We know that some tropical ecosystems are being destroyed at a very fast rate, and this can lead to biodiversity and loss of species. We also have some evidence that the displacement of some food crops by bioenergy can lead to some of the rises in food prices that we saw post-2008. It's not all attributable to bio, but some of it is. And then there are other indirect effects. So if we degrade tropical environments, we lose soil carbon, and this also then contributes to greenhouse gases. There are societal concerns about growing biofuel crops, and there are concerns related to genetic modification. Should we use genetic modification to supply these biofuel feedstocks? What about changing the landscape? We have some preconceived ideas about how the landscape should look, how the UK landscape should look. We can question those, but nevertheless, investment in bio would change the landscape. And then water use and management, is that likely to be impacted? So it's a more complicated picture, and we move towards this state of trying to define what might be a good biofuel and what might be a bad biofuel. As I've said before, this addresses this energy, water, food nexus. So is bioenergy really low carbon? Can we grow bioenergy crops on land which isn't required for food crops? Ecosystem services, things like water, climate regulation, amenity, how are we impacting those if we start changing the land to bio? And general sustainability, can we develop sustainability criteria that identify the good and the bad bioenergy crops? Of course, we didn't do this with food crops. We didn't say when we were trying to feed the world that, well, let's have sustainability criteria for growing these crops. And so food crops rate pretty badly in these sustainability criteria. But of course, the major reason for developing these crops was greenhouse gas emission reduction. And so sustainability criteria are needed. So what are good and bad biofuels? Well, in the European context, they're this. So pre-2012, the directive stated that we have to have an improved energy balance. So we have to have a reduction of 35% in greenhouse gas emission, so relative to a fossil fuel chain. They can't be competitive with land for food production. That has to be maintained. So we need to use abandoned, disused, marginal land with no impact on biodiversity. Can we find any such land? Does it exist? And we can't grow these crops on pristine land with high carbon soils. So that rules out most of Scotland actually, because that's where most of our peaty soils are and they have a lot of carbon locked up in them, for example. So that was where we were pre-2012. Post-2012 we have an extension of that policy, and this is associated with the thing I mentioned earlier, the thing we call the system boundary. And it really depends where we draw our system boundary. If I take a field of grass in the UK, I plough it up and grow trees for bioenergy, that system may have a better greenhouse gas balance, that single field. However, that grass may have been feeding cows or cattle, and ultimately it displaces other land. And so if we then say, well, actually, that feeding is then taking place elsewhere, and ultimately we can track back to even another country where we've displaced the food crop that might have been grown there. So this is what we call an indirect land use change, or ILUC. And Europe has considered ILUC in extensive detail, and we have defined now a series of ILUC factors, and we've defined these for food crops, if we use food crops for fuel, or if we use oil crops, or if we use these lignocellulosic second generation crops. So we're now saying in Europe that we will limit food crops to 5% by 2020 in their use in the supply for bioenergy. So this food or fuel argument will really break down, because in Europe food crops will largely not be allowed to be used for energy uses. The minimum greenhouse gas saving will increase to 60%. So there has to be emissions improvement over a similar fossil fuel chain. And we've defined these ILUC factors. So a factor of 12 for cereals used for bioenergy, but ramping up to 55 for something like oilseed rape, if we use oilseed rape as a crop to produce biodiesel. Because we now know that the the likelihood is that that will displace a food crop. And so combined with that, the ILUC factor for second generation lignocellulosics in Europe has been set at 0. Now there are various models that go into making these ILUC factors. They're combinations of biophysical models that describe crop performance and also world trade models. And if anyone's interested, I can point you in some further the direction for some further details on that. So we're trying in Europe very hard to make these sustainability criteria for bioenergy crops work. And into the future there'll be a move to these second generation non-food crops. But combined with that, can our land actually help us contribute more to this low carbon economy? Well, we know that global agriculture does indeed contribute 11 to 30% of annual carbon dioxide emissions. We know that the UK sector is contributing about 8%, and there is an expectation that several million tonnes of our emissions should be reduced by modifying agriculture into the future. And so this is a term which we call the natural fix, and it's even part of the Kyoto Protocol that we could use offset from forests, carbon in forests, this natural fix to help commit to emissions reductions. And so this is the context in which we're working in the UK on bioenergy crops. So there are two ways then that a bioenergy crop can be effective. The first is the top there, fossil fuel substitution. Instead of using a fossil fuel crop, you use a feedstock from a biological source. And then the term at the bottom, improve carbon sink. So plants gain carbon in photosynthesis, we might harvest some for the bio, but they also place a lot down into the soil resource. So carbon in roots and also some woody biomass that might be stored. And in general, the fossil fuel substitution, so the offset, is much greater than this sequestration. However, it is still an important positive factor if we think about bio. So these are the considerations that we often draw on when we're trying to make carbon budgets for different bioenergy chains. And I just wanted to show you a little bit of detail about how we do that. This is some of our research work that was published by Rowe et al. In Biofuels in 2011. And you can see here the complexity of two chains. So it's a bioenergy chain for heat and power and a biofuel chain for liquid fuel. And you can see that there are various steps: cultivating, harvesting, transport, storage, drying, processing, and then conversion to the fuel. And similarly for the biofuel chain. And at each of these steps we measure the carbon cost of that process. So for example, cultivation of a crop. Every time a tractor drives over a field, we measure the carbon that costs, and we also measure the embedded carbon in making the tractor. And there are various ways of trying to quantify these. And so we can see that in a more graphical form, that you have this whole life cycle carbon analysis where we break down and look at every single process from growing the trees or the crops right through to making the fuel. And we now know that a lot of the black box, the unknowns, are in this part of growing the crop. How much carbon goes to the soil, how much is lost in the process of respiration, and what can we do about it? And so there's a lot of active research in that area. This is quite a complicated figure, but it just shows some of the real data that goes towards making those life cycle analyses, LCAs, for carbon. And it's the result of some systematic reviewing that we've done. And if you do this, we can say without a shadow of a doubt that in the majority of cases, most biofuel and all bioenergy chains, so biofuel for liquid transport, bioenergy for heat and power, tend to provide reductions in greenhouse gas emissions compared to their fossil fuel equivalent. That's just generally the case. Second generation biofuels outperform first generation food crops. Heat and power outperforms liquid fuels, and there's this big uncertainty about what happens in the soil. And then another big thing is how we use the co-products, the waste products that come off the system. And you can see that here. So for liquid fuels, the second generation crops here are better than the first generation crops here. And similarly, we see that the heat and power crops highlighted in yellow there are better. They have a lower carbon footprint than all of the liquid biofuel crops. So that's a very good summary of where we're at, really. If you're thinking about, well, what are good and what are bad biofuels, that's how you need to think about it. And we can do some more work. This is some more detailed work about mapping those impacts across the UK. So we have models that can take those point source data. We can provide maps. And we know that these second generation non-food bioenergy crops have generally a better greenhouse gas balance than food crops such as wheat, oil and oilseed rape. What about other aspects of the environment? Greenhouse gases, water, nitrogen, biodiversity, climate change. We can try and use a framework to quantify these impacts, and that framework we tend to use is called ecosystem services. It's a concept you've probably come across before, and we can define that as the benefits gained by us from the environment. And ecosystem services we can think of as provisioning, things like food, water, energy, which we've been discussing, regulating, how they regulate the climate, for example, the hydrological cycle, control of diseases, amenity or cultural services, which enhance our recreational opportunities. They may have spiritual impacts. And then supporting services, the biogeochemical cycles, carbon, nitrogen, and pollination, important pollination services. So we can begin to think more widely about how bioenergy crops either have negative or positive effects on these ecosystem services. And that's really where the research is at. We've ticked one box. We know much more about the biogeochemical cycles, about how the carbon is used in bioenergy crops. What we don't know so much about is those other services. We're beginning to get some of those data, and here's a worrying figure. It's a paper that was published in the last few years, which gives, if you focus on the first column there, the total water footprint of a range of bioenergy crops, you can see there that jatropha, which is a non-food bioenergy crop and has been hailed as a crop, an oily crop that could be important for the future, uses a lot of water compared to something down at the top of the figure there, sugar beet. So there's a whole range of amounts that these crops use in their water footprint, and we need to be aware of that. So water could be an issue. And when we look at some of our crops in the UK, we're not yet certain as to how much water they will use. So they may use more water than some of our food crops currently do. And that's just another way of looking at those data. If we try to determine how much of those crops are grown globally and see what the impact on the water footprint might be, we can see right out at the far right there that soybean is an important crop. It uses a lot of water and it's grown a lot, and it's now being used extensively for bio. And so there are some worrying signs there, and water is something that we need to watch. Water has been identified as possibly one of the most important aspects of climate change, and here bioenergy may be contributing to that negatively. We've mentioned these other environmental benefits, costs and benefits, and I've put a website there that you can look at. It's a large UK consortium that was empowered over 5 years to quantify some of these services for UK ecosystems. And also to finish off, we mentioned genetic modification, GM technologies, are they relevant? Well, here's an example of some GM trees which might be deployed for bioenergy. So we do have technologies, transgenic, genetic modification approaches that might be useful to modify in a rapid way the genome of plants to make them more applicable for bioenergy. So we can see here that these plants, the control, are much smaller than the modified plant. And some researchers now have modified the lignin biochemistry in the lignocellulosic resource so that the cell walls of trees disassemble much more easily. And when they do that, these trees produce about a 50% increase, net increase in bioethanol. And so that's what we might call a step change, where bioethanol can be more readily taken from these trees with a lower carbon cost. And although that technology isn't socially acceptable in Europe, in the rest of the world, in North and Southern America, in Australia, in China, and other places, the technologies are being deployed to grow trees, at least to trial them, to look at their potential in the context of bioenergy and biofuel. So it's a technology that we need to keep watching. Where does the UK currently get biofuel from? Well, in this particular year, which I think was about 2009, mostly from Argentina, soybean from Argentina, with a lot of Brazilian sugarcane. Are these fuels sustainable? Well, we have a commitment to Europe to measure the greenhouse gas savings of these fuels, and we can see here how some of the major companies are doing, and some of them are meeting the requirements and some of them are not quite meeting those requirements. And of course we know here we're talking about a 40 to 50% greenhouse gas balance improvement, but we know that's going to ramp up. So through legislation there are more and more stringent controls being placed on industry to make biofuels more and more sustainable. So where's the science going? Well, I hope I've given you an indication of that we're currently in an area, a space where right at the left-hand side of this figure, where we've used food crops for fuel, and we're starting to develop second-generation crops. And the startups are beginning, the companies are beginning to take this forward in the US and other places, to use lignocellulosic resource, and also to use municipal waste to try to gain energy. And then as that becomes more of an accepted technology, we can see that the third generation bioalgal fuels might come online 2025, 2030, and who knows, as we move beyond that, the hope is that infrastructure will be available, that we might be looking seriously at electric or hydrogen powered vehicles, with the exception of course that aviation and heavy haulage may not be able to use those technologies, and so there could be a niche role for biofuels in that context. And so that's where we're at the moment. So I hope I've convinced you that there is an energy gap, that demand is growing and fossil fuels must be used less. We have to figure out ways to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions, and these are largely associated with fossil fuels. Bioenergy is a huge potential resource, but the way we use it, we have to think rather carefully about that. There are some good and bad biofuels. And even in the UK, it's likely that we'll be seeing these sustainable good biofuels, the non-food crops, in greater amounts in the future. And there's a source of references for those of you who want to get into the nitty-gritty. Thanks very much.